So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon in Vietnam, good morning in France, and welcome to this last webinar of our long series related to the COP26 report of the GEM Vietnam project. So with this last session, I will present the main features of the multi-sectoral stock flow consistent model that we have been building during this project, and we have been using it to assess the macroeconomic aspects of climate impacts in the COP26 reports. So we are happy to welcome Mrs. Hoai from CM as a discussant for this after this presentation. So I will try to make my presentation in a bit less than 30 minutes, most probably, and then Mrs. Hoai, you will be free to comment on the results and the model. And I think that I see in the audience that there are many experts in macro modeling in Vietnam. So I'm sure there will be also a very nice discussion on the with the audience afterwards. So maybe let me start by sharing my slides. So one second, that should be this one. So can you see my screen? Hopefully, yes.
Yes, but not full screen.
And now full screen?
Yeah, now full screen. Okay.
Okay, so let me start with the context and objectives of this study, although you may have very good ideas about this already if you have participated in the previous sessions of the webinar. So the context is about the question of the vulnerability of Vietnam to climate impacts and climate damages. So I just took some pictures that you have already seen in one of the first sessions of the webinar in terms of the projected evolution of temperature for Vietnam in the case of the RCP 8.5, so which is the worst case scenario at the end of the century compared to the average of the recent period on the left-hand side. So just to remind about the key, let's say, the key variable that is often used in most impact assessments or damage assessments at the country level using the average daily average temperature. So if this kind of macroeconomic assessments of climate damages are starting to be more and more numerous, when we started the project, there were not so many. There were actually quite a lot of sectoral studies or local regional studies on the impact of climate change on, let's say, agriculture in the Mekong Delta or energy in this or that place. But few studies were actually trying to assess in an exhaustive way the economy-wide effects of climate change, except one that was actually conducted between UNU-WIDER and CM in 2012, and that used a CG model, dynamic CG model, to evaluate the climate impacts on growth and welfare, looking mainly at the impact of climate change on crop yields, hydropower production, and the impact on the regional road networks. Of course, now, and there's also, apart from the GEM Vietnam project, there was also a project from GIZ that is running right now a little bit at the same time, and we have had discussions with the scientists and experts on the key differences between our modeling approach and the results we get. So that's always a very interesting work to be done when we have the opportunity to compare different modeling approach on the same on the same kind of evaluation, same kind of topic. So that's actually ongoing with GIZ at the moment. So I would say the benefit of our modeling approach is that we integrate the financial side and more generally the balance sheet of the different actors in the economy. And in that aspect, it differs from the CGE model approach by looking at how the financial side, the financial sector, and so the capacity to save or the need for financing affects the real side of the economy, and how this might change the assessment of the climate impacts on the economy. So that's the objective. So to propose an economy-wide assessment of the economic effects of climate change on the Vietnamese economy by using an empirical stock flow consistent macroeconomic model. So key aspects of the method. Actually, we were inspired by different sources in the existing literature, but one of those was this paper by Xiong and co-authors from 2017, published in Science, and which tried to assess the economic cost of climate change in the US via a combination of multiple climate scenarios on one side, quantitative meta-analysis of sectoral and social impacts based on all kinds of existing studies on the other side, and then an aggregation and integration within a macroeconomic CGE model. And of course, in our case, we will be what we call an SFC, stock flow consistent macroeconomic model. So that's basically the approach we have in the COP26 reports, the very general approach. So we have specific work on climate scenarios, downscaling and bias correcting these climate scenarios on Vietnam. So that work was presented by the team of Professor Ngo Duc Thanh from USTH a few webinars ago. Then the idea is to have sectoral assessments of climate impacts. More specifically, we looked in the COP26 report at agriculture in the face of temperature increases, but also in the face of sea level rise. We looked at energy impacts, and mainly on the supply side, hydro impacts, hydro production impacts, and on the demand side, residential electricity consumption impacts. So for hydropower production impacts, it's the impact is driven mainly by the change in precipitation regime. And then we had more general variables that we tried to assess, like the impact on the number of workers via labor productivity impacts, the impacts on total factor productivity based using firm level data, and the impact on the mortality rate, so health in the more general sense, that will then affect the dynamics of our macro trajectories. So that's the very general approach we have throughout the report, and that we summarize then in the last chapter of this report, the chapter 13, by developing the macroeconomic aspects. So as basically I just mentioned, we value we have three main steps. First, the valuation of direct damages on economic sectors or more social variables using existing studies or specific studies that were conducted within the project. So agriculture, again, energy, labor productivity, total factor productivity, and health. And within health, we have both mortality and the impact of climate change on infectious diseases. That was really the first webinar that was presented at the beginning of the sequence. So second step, we evaluate damage function out of these empirical studies, and we evaluate the direct impact using different climate projections. So we'll present that today. And third step, the aggregation at the national, to build a national level damage function and to see what is this direct damage impact, and also the macroeconomic impact when we put these sectoral damages as an input of the stock flow coherent macroeconomic model. And we will see that direct impacts are different from the overall macroeconomic impacts, and by quite a large percentage. So that means that evaluating the climate impacts from on the economy cannot be reduced to the addition of direct sectoral impacts. We have to take into account macroeconomic dynamics, because they tend, here in our case at least, they tend to amplify the direct impacts. So first, a few points on the direct climate damages. So agriculture comes first. It's the one sector that we start thinking immediately when we think about climate impacts. In Vietnam, especially, the economy is still quite dependent on agriculture. It's the second world largest rice exporter, at least in 2021. And we know that climate change through temperature, rainfall, extreme weather will affect agricultural yields, especially rice yields. And we've used all existing studies from the last 5 to 10 years to build out of the data of these existing studies a kind of average rice yield change that we will use as a damage function for the rice sector in our macroeconomic model afterwards. So these are the key. So, yeah, so that's for agriculture. Sorry, I will present the damage function afterwards. On the energy side, again, so we had an in-house study on hydropower production in Vietnam and the impact of climate change on hydropower production. And we had also an in-house study on the demand side and how rising temperature and weather extremes will affect electricity demand. So we can consider that these are not direct impacts because it's a change in the behavior of households, but it's still through this change of behavior, it's still something that has a cost and is meaningful for the economy as a whole. So we included it in this damage evaluation. So same way, except that in this case, we didn't use meta-analysis, but we used our own in-house studies. We built from this sectoral exercise a specific Vietnamese specific damage function for hydropower and residential electricity demand that I will show later. Third aspect is labor productivity. And here you have lots of different types of studies, some looking at the impact on work hours lost. Some others are just looking at the impact on a variable called WBGT, which is basically a measure of the capacity of human beings to support a mix of temperature and humidity. And we use all of these studies in a meta-analysis and translated them into working hours lost, even when the initial variable was WBGT, to be able to build statistical damage functions linking working hours lost to a change in Vietnamese mean temperature. Other direct damages that were used were the impact of climate change on mortality. So here we have, in the COP26 report, we have a full chapter on health impacts. One aspect of that chapter is the evaluation of how changes in extreme temperatures might lead to additional mortality. The question then with this mortality dynamics is how to value it. So we use two ways. in order to assess the direct damages, we value it by using the value of statistical life, which is of course something very sensitive to the type of hypothesis you consider to value statistical life in a specific country. But we still used it because if we didn't, we would value this mortality to 0 in the direct impact assessment. In the macroeconomic model, we simply have a representation of the demography of Vietnam with an explicit mortality variable, and so we could represent it explicitly without having to make a strong choice of evaluation, such as the value of statistical life. We simply have the demographic dynamics explicitly modeled in the macroeconomic model. And finally, total factor productivity was assessed by using firm level data, and because in the Vietnamese government, it's expected that this total factor productivity represents a very strong share of GDP growth in the future. It was quite essential to try to assess how TFP could be damaged by climate impacts. So by using this firm level data, we had an observation of how TFP might have been affected by climate change in the past, and use this damage function as well for projections. So then the exercise that I present here in this graph is just the addition of all these different direct damage functions that have been combined then to different future climate scenarios. So we have all the future climate scenarios that are available at the Vietnamese level. So coming from RCP 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5. So you have the different colors representing these different RCPs here. And on the y-axis, the direct damages in terms of percentage of GDP. So that gives you an idea, rough idea, with an uncertainty range, of course, about the direct damages in terms of percentage of GDP, depending on the temperature increase in Vietnam relative to the recent period. So, for example, when you take the 1 degree temperature change, so it's 1 degree above the recent period. So it's not the 1 degree global average temperature, and be careful. And that leads to an additional damage of a bit more than 5% on average, with an uncertainty range going from 3% to 9%. So that's the kind of direct damages that you can represent using these sectoral damage functions. Now that's just the direct impacts, and what we want to assess is how sectoral interlinkages and macroeconomic dynamics might affect these impacts, might amplify or reduce these impacts, and that's when we use a macroeconomic model. So in our case, again, we built with and Thi Thu Hoai could not be available today because she's flying back from Vietnam to France, but she has been working extensively on that model. It's a stock flow consistent model again, which starts by building balance sheets and a flow matrix for the key 5 institutional sectors of the economy, using data from 96 to 2019. So it's estimating over this time range based on the national system of national accounts. And then for the financial data, we have to combine and integrate other data sources, mainly from IMF, World Bank, or the Bank of International Settlements. Now the accounting, so that's for the balance sheet structure. Then the accounting and behavioral equations made it behavioral equations were estimated using vector error correction models and OLS estimations. So this is the simplified balance sheet of Vietnam that we use. So you see the 5 institutional sectors: firms, central bank, which has been separated from the banking sector, government, households, and the rest of the world. And you see here the balance sheet of each one of those actors. So when there is a plus, it's on the asset side. When there is a minus, it means that it's on the liability side of the actor. You can look at the balance sheet column by column to see what is the composition of the balance sheet in terms of different types of financial instruments. That's the real side of the economy, the non-financial transactions. So you see the same actors: firms, central bank, banks, government, households, and you have the decomposition of GDP in the 3 ways: so the production account, operating account, then the allocation of primary income accounts, then the redistribution of income account, and you end up with the net. The last line is the net financial capacity. So either it's positive, so that means that the agent, the firm, for example, have capacity to finance, so they will have to allocate their wealth to some specific financial assets, or they have a need for financing, and so that means that they will need to be financed by other actors, and that's where our type of modeling differs from, let's say, CGE models usually, where CGE models just stop there at this line of net financing capacity, while we explicitly represent how the different actors finance themselves or allocate their savings to different financial assets. And these type of allocation, or these the way the actors finance themselves, has in itself an impact on the real economy, and that's our hypothesis. Now we allocate the production between different sectors because, of course, what we are interested in is the sectoral impacts of climate change. We want to put as an input to this model the different sectoral damage functions that we have measured and that I have presented a few minutes ago. So agriculture, energy, industry, and then we have financial services, public services, and other services as well. We make the hypothesis of adaptive expectations, meaning that it's a demand-driven model where production comes from expected sales and excess demand. The impact of climate damages is represented again on agriculture through rice yields changes, energy sector, hydropower and production, and aggregate mortality rate on population growth. So then I have a few slides to just describe the behavior of the key agents within the economy. So for example, households here, starting with households, they use what we call their disposable income to basically consume, invest, and accumulate financial assets, what we would call saving in a most general framework. So they accumulate financial assets in cash, deposits, in equities, or in government bonds. So then they can also borrow from banks for their investment. And they are impacted by climate change through different channels. First, through the number of working hours that they can dedicate to working for firms, and through also the residential electricity demand that will affect their final consumption. On the firm's side, the most important equation is the investment of the firm. Basically, firms investment depends on the expectation of growth and the cost of financing themselves to the bank, so the real interest rate. The financing of firms' investment comes from first using their retained profits, then second, and borrowing from banks or from abroad, and the bulk of the financing comes from issuing equities or attracting FDI. That's how it is represented in the model. Then the climate change impacts on firms come from two different channels. The channel of total factor productivity that will affect heavily actually the dynamics of investment, and then the mortality rate that will reduce the availability of workers to work in the productive sectors, of course. So other main features of the model for central banks and monetary policy, the central bank have a kind of mixed objective of inflation and exchange rate dynamics. So they provide a refinancing rate and they manage their international reserves to maintain the exchange rate within a small boundary of fluctuations. Then commercial banks and commercial banks fix their deposit rate and their lending rate above, with a margin above the refinancing rate. That has been estimated based on the past data. And for the rest of the world, so we have the relation with the rest of the world go through different variables. So trade, of course, but also remittances from the rest of the world. You have also capital flows and the exchange rate, which could eventually play an important role, but in Vietnam it's very controlled via central bank policies. Then you have prices equation and the wage rates that of course plays a key role in the dynamics of the model. Moving to key results of this exercise, and we'll start with the baseline scenario, because the exercise we have is we build a baseline scenario up to 2050 using different hypotheses that actually we discussed with CM, so that they're both reasonable in terms of general data availability, but also in terms of the strategy of the Vietnamese government for the next, at least for the next decade, and with maybe a longer vision as well. So for example, on the population side, we use UN population projections for Vietnam. We keep an hypothesis of a very low unemployment rate, which is the value of 2019. We keep the same capital depreciation rate at the value of 2019. Then we use the IMF hypothesis in terms of share of public expenditures and share of public investment. Then the important question was the growth rates of world GDP, where we based our projections with using the SSP scenarios, the so-called shared socioeconomic pathways, coming from the previous IPCC report. So we are updating this in our final report to the latest IPCC report. Then we use OECD projections for the demand for real imports of trading partners. We make the hypothesis that world price of imports grow at 1% per year. We take the required bank reserves ratio to the value of 2019, and for the price of equity of the rest of the world, we use the US price and make the hypothesis of an average growth rate of the last 5 years. And we take the US interest rate. For the US interest rate, we take the Fed's projections. So you have a whole list in the model, a list of exogenous variables where you have to make some prospective hypothesis to build a baseline scenario. And then we added to this baseline scenario basically the different sectoral damage functions that I described, combined with different climate change scenarios available for Vietnam in the different RCPs. And so using all these different scenarios, there were a bit more than 30 of them for each RCP. We can assess on average and with the uncertainty range, the macroeconomic loss. So in terms of GDP here, in 2020, because we just started the simulation in 2019, 2030, and 2040s. So you can see that the red horizontal line is the median value, and then you have the uncertainty range and the outliers of the simulations in both the case of RCP 4.5 on the left-hand side and RCP 8.5 on the right-hand side. So that gives you the macroeconomic damage as a percentage of GDP loss relative to the baseline scenario that I just described. An interesting exercise again was to compare the direct damages that I showed earlier here to the macroeconomic damages that I show basically here. And you can play by showing when you just consider agriculture damages, not the rest of the damages. So you compare direct damages on agriculture to the macroeconomic impacts when you consider agriculture impacts. And you do the same for mortality, for labor productivity, for TFP, for energy. So like sector by sector, damage function by damage function. But you can also do this exercise with all the damage functions included at once. And that's the left box that you can see, all damages. And that the result is quite interesting because it shows that because the value you see the median value is 128. So that means that the macro impacts on average are 30% or 28% higher to the relative direct impacts. So the macroeconomy, as represented in our model, tends to amplify the direct impacts of climate change, and that's also a result that we want to emphasize and compare with other macro modeling approach to see if this is robust in different settings. So at the conclusion, we have in this exercise 5 sectoral impacts: agriculture, energy, labor productivity, mortality, and TFP. We assess the direct impacts using all climate scenarios available. We compare them to the macroeconomic impacts using a new empirical stock flow consistent model of the Vietnamese economy. We show that macro impacts in our setting are on average 30% higher than the direct damages. Then, of course, there are new paths and new horizons for the research. First, we could incorporate or update at least the damages on other sectors, and using the new climate model projections of the latest IPCC reports. So that's something we are working on right now for the final national macro reports of the project. There are policy implications that we have not yet investigated in detail. So how to represent adaptation in that setting, how to model the financing of adaptation, and the different financing options for adaptation. That's also something we want to have in this incoming final report for COP27. Because then depending on different financing options for adaptation, and let's say also the import intensity of adaptation, then the macroeconomic dynamics of adaptation strategies might be very different. And of course, after COP26, we need to develop a new baseline scenario because we have this very important net zero announcement of Vietnam. Vietnamese Prime Minister at COP26, and this builds in itself a new baseline scenario with a very strong structural change towards net zero in 2050. And we want now to assess how climate damages and adaptation strategies will evolve in addition to this new net zero horizon. So that's basically the kind of internal discussions we have right now, and that open quite a lot of further developments. So thank you. Thanks a lot for your attention. And I think we can start maybe, Mrs. Hoai, if you are here with us with your questions or comments, and then open the discussion to the audience.
Yes. Good afternoon, Etienne and everyone from Vietnam. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations and papers. I enjoy very much the presentations, and quite impressed. And I think this is very good and comprehensive paper. And I know you put a lot of work and effort to this paper. And as you already mentioned, in Vietnam, there are not many, very few macroeconomic models to assess the macro impacts of climate change. So this is one of the very good model can be used for that purpose. Besides the one you already mentioned on the one from GIS projects. This is very suitable for measuring the macro impacts of climate change, because it represents interlinkage of the sector of the industry sector in the economies, and also capture the dynamics of the economy. But one of the I think is one of the advantage strengths of the model is the integration of financial sector, and I think this one is quite unique compared to other model, and this is very good, I think, and it can be used for many others analysis. The second thing is that the finding of this paper, the presentation is quite a good information to warn the Vietnamese government about the climate change impacts, because you can see that the loss of GDP to percentage of the PC's GDP by 2040 is around about 10% of GDP loss, so it's quite a lot, and it also provides one more persuasive evidence for the government to do more about the climate change adaptation. We need to have a good adaptation strategy in order to eliminate or reduce the negative impacts, and in order to achieve our very ambitious development tasks in the future, given the serious impacts, negative impact of climate change. And the last one is for the comment on the paper is that, as you already mentioned, and the configurations of the model also, so that we can use it, is very useful for simulate the different policy responding to climate change. So we can use the model for so many different policy simulation, and this will help the Vietnamese government in selecting the best policy for the future. So I just have 2 comments and 1 question on the paper. The first one is I'm a little bit concerned about the double counting and also overestimating the impacts, because the way you the model set up, I think for example the impacts on the first one is on the agriculture, and also the impacts on TFP may be duplicate, because it's not maybe not a big duplication, but I think it's also a little bit duplication here. And also another thing more worrying here is that as you can see that the impacts through the TFP is the largest impact, negative impact on GDP from the more result. And the TFP for the input information, the micro result of this impact, as you mentioned, using the enterprise survey. And for Vietnam, enterprise sector does not capture the whole economy, because we have a quite a large part, about 30% is household sector. So it will. So I think when you use that input for the whole economy, it may to some extent, I think, may overestimate the negative impacts. So it should be a little bit careful on this one, and maybe some way to do some kind of sensitivity analysis here. It will help and provide a better, picture on the macro impacts. And the second comment is also relating to the one advantage of this model is a financial sector. I think it's very good. So you can see the linkage between the real sector and the financial sector, and there are many policy simulation you can do here in the future about how to finance the climate change, the policy response. So I think it's good. Maybe you explain or maybe stress more on this chance of the model, because for others, for example, for the IGS model, they can do also the same, but they don't have this kind of sector representative in their model. Although they have kind of regional dimension in their model that you don't have, but one of those chances is the financial sector. And the last one is my questions, because you mentioned earlier that if we can see that compared to the direct impacts, whether through this macro impact is reduce or amplify the impacts but my thinking is that it seems that the model is structured, set up in a way that the impact is always amplified rather than to be reduced, like or any kind of mechanism, or maybe the variable that capture the response or behavior, the behavior of the entity in the model to respond to the climate change. So the impact will be reduced through the model. So my question is that, in short, is it always the impact will be always amplified compared to the micro model, the result of micro model? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the many interesting comments and points. So I will try to answer at least some of them. To start with, so I of course agree with the good points you mentioned on the model, the advantage of this integration of the financial sector. Well, the overall result we get in terms of with our exhaustive or almost exhaustive approach to climate change impacts, and also the potential use of the model for different policy purposes, and that's clearly something we want to discuss further with you, because we really think that the model itself can be used by ICM or among other maybe institutes as a tool in terms of more short run or medium run policy making or policy assessment. Now, the first comment was mainly on the question of double counting and overestimating the impacts. So I have to admit that's a possibility, that we tend to overestimate or double count somehow the impacts, but it depends on us on one key question, which is the implicit production function that we have, and depending on the choice, because in this model we don't have a supply constraint. Let's say it's purely demand driven, as it was present in the COP26 reports. We may now add some supply constraint, but as it is in the COP26 report, it was purely demand-driven model, so without supply constraints, so without a production function. Then, depending on the choice you make about the production function, you may consider that you can add up all the impacts, or you have some substitution, and that depends on this hypothesis you make on the production function. So I would say that agriculture and TFP may indeed duplicate, but they may not also so much duplicate, depending on this strong hypothesis that you have to make. Is it a Cobb Douglas? Is it a Leontief? Or is it a CES? So that's a very important question. Actually, we don't answer it in the model we present in the COP26 report, because we don't have a production function. We have a purely demand-driven model. So now I agree with your point on the way we evaluate TFP. Of course, it's through enterprise survey. I agree that it does not capture the whole economy, but can we infer from this that we overestimate the impact on TFP? I'm not sure. Maybe we overestimate, maybe we underestimate. We don't know actually that what is the impact on TFP on the part of the economy that is not captured by the enterprise survey. So you may agree that we need more to say if this is an overestimation of the TFP impact. But I agree that sensitivity analysis, uncertainty analysis is a key question for the COP26 report. We mainly had an uncertainty analysis on the climate scenarios, but not enough, I agree, on the key more economic or damage assessment, the damage function assessment. So that's something we will work on in the final report. Now your second point is on let's say the more macro and financial side of the model, and again, COP26 report was a very good opportunity to take stock of what was already done in the project so far, but it's not everything. And we haven't exploited enough yet the financial side. We haven't shown the evolution of the balance sheets, the financial side of the different actors in the economy. And so we have been working a lot on this recently, and we present that aspect much more in the results in the final report. Your last point, which was the key question, do we have a model that is structurally built to amplify the impacts of climate change? So I would say no, not necessarily, because if you look at the slide where we make this comparison of direct impacts compared to macroeconomic impacts, there are already some scenarios where actually the macro impact is less than the direct impact. So that means it's not structurally, it may be biased towards amplifying the impacts, but it's not built in the structure. So you can have scenarios where actually the macro impact is lower than the direct impacts, very specific climate scenarios. So now what is true is that to answer properly your question, we would need basically a structural decomposition analysis of those scenarios where the impact is amplified versus the scenarios where the impact is reduced compared to the direct impacts. And we haven't had the time to do that as well. So we can only show the results on all the results combined and the median value, but we cannot explain enough in detail which behavioral equation might have driven the results most, so that's the impact is amplified or reduced. So that was a very good comment as well. Yes, I mean, all in all, these are my main answers to your comments. I don't know if you
thank you very much. I think it's reasonable response.
Okay, thank you very much, and we look forward to develop these new aspects with you as well in the final assessments. Maybe we can open the floor to questions from the audience if there are some, and I think it's possible to add anyone to the stage so that you can ask the question yourself. So don't hesitate to raise your hand. So I see a hand. Yes, Christophe. So I think I can allow you to speak. You should be able to speak, Christophe.
Should work, no? Is it?
Yep.
Does it? Good,
Yep.
Perfect. Just for a question, I mean, we talk about this model all the time, and one question came up during this talk now. So how does basically adaptive behavior of agents come into play here? So how do you actually consider this potential of adaptation? So how, let's say, just assume, how would an agent in the model adapt, and what is the channel why an agent in the model adapts to like climate change?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, in the COP26 report, we don't model adaptation. So we're trying to add that into the model now. But the idea is that you would have to, firms would have to invest on that adaptation capital. So that means that's a cost. You have to finance your investment. And that allows you to raise the adaptation rate that will reduce your damages. So of course we are in a simulation model, so we don't necessarily look at optimization problems, but still you have this arbitrage between the adaptation costs and the cost of damages that you tend to avoid. So
okay,
that's,
no,
yeah.
I was not
Yeah.
like referring to adaptation measures explicitly modeled like I have this potential, but like going out of, for example, more affected sectors. So I think this kind of thing should be included there, right? Or not? Like,
so sorry, I didn't understand.
More affected sectors, like sectors, if the energy sector has a higher decline in productivity due to climate change, but another sector like the services sector has a lower decline, there might be more economic activities switching or moving from the energy sector to the services sector to some extent.
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question, because your question is about is the structural change in the economy endogenous in a way?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no.
Okay.
So what we have though is price effects, but that doesn't lead, because it's not allowed. It's blocked in the current version of the model. That doesn't allow to big shifts in the structure of the economy.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I see Tuan and maybe Emmanuel as well. So Tuan first, maybe. You can talk, I think.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for very nice presentation and interesting. I have a question. As you know, there are multiple factors influencing risk, and so the losses, impact, and damages are linked to climate change. So when something happens, it's not just the losses or economic damages. It's not just about the magnitude of the event itself, but on many other factors like urbanization. Recently, Vietnam, like in Hanoi, we experienced some kind of major localized flooding, and a lot of people talking about poor urbanization in planning in the cities, for example. And in the future, the losses and damages, I mean, the increase of 1 degree Celsius will have different impact given the current condition compared to the future, social economic condition of the countries. I mean, it depends on many other factors, the way different sector develop, or the way we plan our cities and our provinces. So my question is, have you consider this kind of reality in your model, or is there any way to take into account this this reality in the model?
Yeah. So thank you, Tuan, for a very important question. To be honest, there are macroeconomic models can do many things, but probably not everything. And so that's also why we had this huge report that had this different complementary, very complementary approach to the problem of climate damage in Vietnam. But still, I think you mentioned loss and damage. So that's one aspect we're thinking a lot right now. So the idea that for some future damages, they're just you cannot adapt. So your adaptation rate, your maximum adaptation rate may lower with the evolution of climate change. So for different sectors, this might be different. The dynamics may be different. For the agriculture sector or for the energy sector, it might be different. But you still have this idea that the maximum you can adapt will tend to lower with the worsening of climate change. So there will be an increasing part of the damages that you cannot avoid, even if you put all your resources to to adaptation. And so that can be explicitly modeled in terms of equation. That's quite simple. The problem is to have a reasonable calibration, reasonable data to actually represent that. And that's I think for adaptation, the data and the reasonable calibration and the cost evaluation is the key issue. Representing adaptation is fine, but having reasonable scenarios is much more difficult. And I think that what Christophe and GIZ did by asking experts is a very interesting first step. Experts in the different sectors, but even that is not probably enough to have a strategic assessment of adaptation, of an adaptation strategy. And that's very difficult to assess this reasonable empirical side of adaptation at the macroeconomic level.
Yeah. And also, is there any ways to like separate, the losses caused by climate change and other factors? Because sometimes I see other factors like poor urban planning, for example, or like a coordination between different infrastructure system in a city or in a province may exacerbate the impact a lot. We have the same event, but the impact in one city in another nearby city may be very different. So can we find a way to somehow separate the impact of climate change and of other like human driver, I would say?
Well, short answer would be to say yes. So for example, in the GIZ model that Christophe develops, behaviors are always optimal. So what you get is if you have an objective function, you optimize your objective function given your constraints, and then you reach an optimum solution. So the most effective way to reach this objective. In our case, we have a different approach because we look at past behaviors and adaptive behaviors given these past observations. So in this sense, agents tend to, of course, adjust to new information, but the trend is that they will keep having the same behavior as they used to have. So in this way, with these two different and very complementary approach, you can, on the one hand, show that if there have been bad coordination in the last 5-10 years. In our case, we'll still represent it because we have observed it in the data. Of course, they will slowly incorporate new information, and you can play with that in the scenarios. And in the case of an optimizing model, you will directly go to the most effective solution given your constraints. So these are a very different approach to simulations, but that allows you to, on the one hand, look at maybe institutional barriers and constraints, and on the other hand, the most effective way.
Okay, thank you, Etienne.
Thank you, Tuan. Are there any other questions or comments or suggestions for improvement? I think Emmanuel, you wanted to have a question, no? You want me to authorize you to speak? Where is Emmanuel? Oh. Or maybe he left just. No, you're here. Okay. So Emmanuel, if you want to speak. No, you don't. Okay. I think you can speak. Okay, maybe because some of the questions by Mrs. Hoai were also related to this. It's clearly what we showed here is a work in progress at one point of time, which was November last year. We're trying to improve some of the questions that have been raised already. That's an ongoing work. And clearly there is a whole new wave of questions that arise from the new normal of Vietnam, which is a net zero structural change. So in this new normal, it becomes very important, I think, as Christophe mentioned, to incorporate structural change and endogenously, to see how the structure of the economy would shift from one sector to the other based on new price informations, but also based on expectation of new damages. So that's I mean that's a key development that will go certainly well beyond this first GEM Vietnam project. So this would be for GEM Vietnam 2, I guess. And there are other issues, like in terms of, I think, structural change and how to finance and fund structural change so that it is not disturbing at the macroeconomic level for Vietnam. And these questions represent a whole new path of applied research that we want to investigate in the more medium to long run. And that's also, I think, interesting for Vietnam. I think Mrs. Hoai will agree with that. I see one question from Christophe.
Well,
oh, sorry. Let me reactivate your sound.
So also coming back to this question of going to zero emissions, I mean, is it the thing what you want to measure is not like what happens? So what would happen without climate change? This is like the baseline scenario. And when you have a specific, I mean, it's always a discussion about what is really the right baseline scenario, right? I mean, is it a baseline scenario just with mitigation policy? And when you look at what is the effect on climate, what the residual effect of climate change is on the economy, or is it what would happen if we just have no climate change at all? So this kind of discussion is maybe more of a philosophical one, but it is also to some extent important in order to have maybe a common understanding what should be a baseline scenario. I mean, what is your thought? Like you right now just have no climate change in your baseline, or?
Yes, we have no climate change in the baseline, and it's always a very disturbing baseline scenario, because you know that it doesn't exist. It won't exist. You will have damages. So actually, maybe a good baseline scenario is to have the scenario, how do you say that? So the RCP 8.5 scenario is the trend we are in right now, because we don't respect collectively the Paris Agreement. So you could take this as a baseline scenario and then measure, instead of measuring the damages, you measure the benefits of avoided damages by looking at different scenarios of global and Vietnamese mitigation of emissions. So that would be another way of presenting things. And that would be a more positive one, I guess, because you would add up the benefits the more you reduce your emissions. But because we ask these questions to ourselves in terms of what does it cost, what does climate damage, what is the cost of climate change, then the implication is we need to build the idea of a completely theoretical scenario where you still have your economy running with high growth rates and whatever the structure of it as a baseline without climate impacts, and then you add the climate impact to this economy, and that's what we define as the damages of climate change on the economy. And I agree with you. That's problematic because this cost doesn't exist anywhere. While you could actually better, and that would be more meaningful to measure the benefit, starting from a highly growing, high climate damage scenario as the baseline, and measuring instead the benefits of reducing both at the world level and Vietnamese level. So that would be an alternative. I don't know what you would think about it, Christophe.
No, it's actually a nice way to formulate it, like more positive and in this benefit way. Yeah, makes sense. The thing is for me more that on the other side, we are not yet sure. No, we are still looking at what will be the impact of climate change on our like well-being and our way of living. And if you just like go and say, yeah, RCP 8.5 is now our baseline scenario, we miss to some extent just a discussion about the damages itself. So, you know, because they have to be fixed when this is also the, I mean, it's not really clear what to do here, but on the other side, what is also a little bit dangerous is if you consider that mitigation by itself might also reduce potential output, at least in the medium run, right? So
not necessarily, yeah.
No, I'm not saying that it has to be like it, but it's also not unlikely that it happens. So that you have to, at least in the developed world, maybe not in the developing world, where it might be really the case, but there is no trade-off. It's more a case of which direction I want to go from now on. But like if you consider Europe, when there isn't trade-off, probably that you either stay with your investments you had in fossil industry and then you switch. And then we also have this discussion of, I mean, you're referring a little bit again to mitigation, but not so much to adaptation to the climate scenario, right? I mean, mitigation policy reducing greenhouse gases leads to structural change. That's true, but to some extent, then the baseline scenario always will change in regard to what SSP scenario we consider, right? So our structural transformation will actually depend on the baseline scenario, which is dependent on the SSP scenario. So when it's pretty getting more and more confusing, then, in order to evaluate the mitigation policies in the specific SSP scenarios. Yeah. But this is just something I just thought about. But yeah.
I agree, and it's getting more and more confusing because now we have to assess really at the same time mitigation and adaptation, especially for countries that have strong announcements, such as Vietnam, and at the same time may have a quite strong impact and need adaptation strategies. So we really have to deal. I mean, that's still an open discussion. What should be the new baseline? Let's say after COP26, what do we really measure out of this baseline? I agree. Thanks for the point.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation.
So if I don't know if there are any further points or discussion. So if there are no more, I think it's not without emotion that we close this long sequence of 13 webinars where we have presented all the different aspects of this big report that was out at COP26. So it's not over with GEM Vietnam. We are currently working on two final reports, one on the Mekong Delta and adaptation of the Mekong Delta to climate and environmental changes, and another one which will really focus on the national level and try to integrate this new normal of net zero for Vietnam while developing further the damage and adaptation side. So this new national report will also be ready. Both of them will be out for diffusion most probably in October, November this year, on time for COP27. And of course, we all know that Vietnam is becoming increasingly an example of a country with a high structural transformation ambitions to climate, to reduce their own emissions, but also high ambitions in terms of adaptation. So this really keeps all the interests of projects like this one to develop further after this first wave of project. And so we're also working on this after GEM Vietnam 1 right now. For those who will be in Vietnam, I will be myself on a mission to Vietnam end of June, and I would be very happy to meet all of you there. Don't hesitate to write me an email if you want to meet. And in any case, I'm sure we will meet soon, at least virtually, for future GEM Vietnam webinars and events. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Hoai, for the very fruitful comments and discussions. And talk to you all very soon.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.